I'm very happy to have Josh with us. Josh is one of those really nice, very kind, really passionate, and really knowledgeable people on the internet. Also happens to have a wonderful blog with really wonderful, funky animations. I keep finding myself just coming back to the website just to play with animations. So if you get like all these heart numbers, they go up because of me.
Well, I appreciate that. You're making me blush.
They're really beautiful, very beautiful. And so I'm really happy to have Josh with us. Also, Josh has a wonderful course, a couple of courses, not just on CSS, but also on React and stuff. So if you have any specific questions about both, please bring them in the question box, and we'll bring them up. But in the meantime, warm round of applause to Josh. Come on.
Hi there. How's it going? How's everyone doing? Good. I haven't injured anyone with the chocolate, I hope? Good. I'd like to start with a scenario that I think many of us have been in at some point or another in our career. And the setup is that I have this image. I've given it a fixed width and height, and I've put it in a parent section. And the only CSS I'm applying is an outline. And if we look at this, we see that the image, there's like a let me see if I can do this. There's a curious little bit of space between the bottom of the image and the bottom of the container. And it's not any of the usual suspects. Like, if we open it in the dev tools, we see that we have this correct size. Our image is the 250 by 250 that I've specified. But there's no padding, there's no border, and there's no margin. And on the parent container, we see that it stretches to fill the horizontal space, which is what we expect. But look at this. It's 256.4. So there's 6.4 pixels of extra sort of unexplainable space. And there's no padding, there's no border, there's no margin. So where is this space coming from? Now, for most of my time as a developer, like I started writing CSS in 2007-ish, so quite a while. And I'm a little embarrassed to admit that for like the first decade of my life as a developer, I didn't have the best attitude when it came to problems like this. I wasn't really curious. Like, I just wanted this problem to go away. I didn't want to be stuck trying to figure out why on earth CSS was doing this incomprehensible thing. And so my solution to this would have been to Google, right? Weird space underneath image. Maybe you find a Stack Overflow thread. You scroll through, ignoring all of the words and all the potential explanations, and looking for code snippets, things that you can copy and paste and cross your fingers and hope that the stupid space goes away. These days, we might use our helpful robot friends to help with this. And just for fun, I decided to ask ChatGPT. So I gave it the question. We're going to ignore all the words. We see a snippet, line height 0 on the parent. It doesn't make a lot of sense, right? Like line height 0. But let's try it. Let's see what happens. Line height 0. And check it out. Just like that, right? Astoundingly, bafflingly, the space disappears. So, if this had happened to me in 2007, I would have said, great, and I would have moved on with my life, right? Gone away and gone on to the next task. And there's two problems when you have this mindset. The first is that it requires that you have a really good memory, because I have to now memorize that line height 0 is the solution to this problem, and it doesn't make any sense. So, you really have to memorize it. And I don't have a good memory, which means that when I run into the same problem in a couple of months or a couple of weeks, I'm going to have to go through the whole process again. But there's a second, bigger, more sinister problem with this approach, which is that when this is your attitude for the entire CSS language, it artificially constrains how much you can actually understand. Like it keeps you at like a novice level, even if you spend years and years practicing CSS. Ask me how I know that. You never really get to the point where you feel like things make sense and are consistent. So in 2017-ish, I decided that I was sick of having this relationship with CSS. And from that moment on, when I would run into problems like this, rather than try to sprint through them, I decided to settle into the problem like it was a nice warm bath, and really try to understand what is going on here and how can I fix it. And the thing that really helped me with this scenario is to see what happens if I have text in this container as well. That's not how you spell world. Let me get rid of line height 0 too. We notice something a little bit interesting, which is that the image, it's perfectly aligned with the bottom of the characters. And so what this told me is that the browser is treating this image like it's just another word in the sentence, right? It's aligning it like it was text. And if I only have text, if I get rid of the image, well, this looks normal, right? This is what we expect text to look like. And we sort of forget that there is apparently 6.4 pixels, or whatever it is, of space between the bottom of the character and the bottom of the line. So that's what's going on here. We have this image that is sort of sitting on that baseline, like text, and that happens even if there is no text. So when we add line height 0, it effectively says every line of text should be 0 pixels tall. And of course, this is like a disaster if we actually have text, because like there is 0 pixels of height for every line. And if the lines overlap, let me make it even smaller, it stops looking like characters. Like it just looks like, I don't know, hieroglyphics or something. So obviously, this is a problem when we have text. Less of a problem when we just have an image, but still, it doesn't really feel like the best solution. Another solution that you'll see online is to select the image and to set vertical align. Now, this property defaults to baseline, which is that imaginary line that the text sits on, but we can also set it to bottom. And if I set it to bottom and make this a little bit bigger, we see that it does indeed solve the problem as well. And this has the advantage that if there is some text in here, it doesn't like obliterate the lines for the text because I'm taking this image and changing where it is aligned to. But it still doesn't feel like the best solution to me. It still sort of feels like we're treating the symptom rather than the disease. Because in my mind, like, if I only have an image like this, I probably don't want it to be treated like just another word in the sentence. I want it to be treated like just another block in my layout. So we can solve that by setting display block. If I can type it out. Yeah, this also solves it. We can also, like alternatively, we can set display flex on the parent. That also solves our problem. So as I started with this new approach to CSS, trying to understand things, all of a sudden, like things that I had to memorize just made sense. And all of these things that seemed totally arbitrary and random, like I started seeing connections between things. And I started having all these mind-blowing realizations that, oh, CSS actually isn't like a wildly unpredictable and inconsistent language. I just was missing these fundamental pieces. And as I started with this mindset shift, and as I started understanding CSS better, I started building a reputation for myself at work as the CSS person. Anyone here is the CSS person at work? A bunch of us, yeah. The cool thing about being the CSS person is that your coworkers come to you with their CSS problems. And they don't come to you when they're like 10 seconds into a problem. They come to you when they're a couple of hours into it, and they've been banging their head on this frustrating situation. And it's a pretty cool feeling to be like, you need to put display block, and then the problem disappears. But it's even cooler to spend like 10 minutes with them and do sort of what I just did here and walk through what's going on and help them build their understanding so that when they hit the same problem in a couple of months, they remember the solution. And I also started teaching around this time. I started teaching at a local coding bootcamp, and there too I got sort of a similar reputation as a CSS person. And so I decided in 2020 that I really enjoyed helping people develop their understanding of CSS, and I left my job and focused on a CSS course that I called, if the image wants to load, there it is, CSS for JavaScript developers. Since I launched this in 2021, something like 18,000 people have taken the course, and I've answered many hundreds of questions about CSS. So this talk is called The Secret Mechanisms of CSS. And essentially, my goal here is to share a bunch of these epiphanies that I've had about the language so that you too can have a deeper understanding. Now, based on the number of hands that I saw, I suspect, and this is, I would have expected this to be true, the SmashingConf audience is more knowledgeable about CSS than a typical developer. It may be that you already know many of the things that I'm going to share, and for people in that circumstance, my hope is that this talk is still useful, because I'm going to give you sort of the explanations, the analogies, the things you can use as the CSS person to help your coworkers understand CSS better when they come to you. So one of the most fundamental reorientations in my mind about CSS was to stop seeing it as a monolithic language. Like, I used to see CSS as like a giant bag of properties, and as you're building layouts, you're like plucking out the things that you need. Like, I need display block and width 100% and background color red. You grab all the properties and sort of assemble them, smush them into one layout. that's not wrong, but I feel like a better way to see CSS is as a bunch of mini languages that exist within CSS that are like related and connected, but also kind of independent. And I'll give you a perfect example as to why I think this is a better way to see it. The setup here is that I have this div class item. I've given it width 2,000 pixels. And we notice that I have these two elements that are both 2,000 pixels wide. It's a little bit hard to see this scroll bar like way down here. So I've given it a gradient so you can see the fact that it is actually that wide. And check this out. I'm going to take the second one, and I'm going to move it so that it exists within a parent that sets display flex. And all of a sudden, it's not 2,000 pixels. Now it is sort of stretchy and flexible. And if you see CSS as nothing more than a collection of properties, this doesn't make any sense, because both this div class item and this div class item have the exact same CSS. Like, they both use the width property in exactly the same way. So why is it doing one thing over here and another thing over there? If you see CSS as a constellation of layout modes, then you realize that, oh, what's happening here is that this div class item is being rendered according to flow layout, right? Normal flow, which I like to call flow layout. And in that layout mode, width is sort of a hard constraint, where if you put width 2,000 pixels, you're going to get something that's 2,000 pixels even if it bursts through the side of the viewport. With this div class item, I'm having the same CSS, but it's being rendered using a different layout mode. The way that I explain this for JavaScript developers is that the layout modes are sort of like different functions, and the CSS that we write, like the key value pairs that we think of as CSS, those are the inputs, those are the arguments. So for this div class item, I'm taking these arguments and handing them to flow layout, which then takes that data and uses it to create this layout. With this div class item, I have the same arguments, but I'm handing them to a different function. So I want to go through a couple of layout modes and share some of the things I've learned about them, starting with flow layout. And like, the thing about flow layout is it makes so much more sense when you think about it as like a word processing algorithm. So here we have Google Docs. I'll make this a little bit bigger. And you know, the interesting thing about word processing layouts is they have at their core two main constraints. One is that you have a limited amount of horizontal space. And this is the case because in a horizontally written language, right, you're reading along the line, and you reach the end of the line, you have to jump to the next one. And if those lines are like 800 characters wide, it's going to be really hard to find your way to the next line. So we have constrained horizontal space, but we have kind of infinite vertical space. Like, our page only has a certain height, but we can have as many pages as we need. So constrained horizontal, unlimited vertical. And then the layout is built using blocks. So like, this heading is a block, this paragraph is a block, a table would also be a block, so would a list. Within these blocks, we can have like sub-selections, and we call these inline elements. So you have like a little bit of bold text here, or a little bit of italic text here. A hyperlink would be also an inline element, some colored text. Images, sort of curiously, are considered inline elements. So if I take this photo, and I want it to like sit off to the side over here and push the text over, I think we've all had this experience working on school projects where you drag it up, and it does this. It scrambles your layout. But where have we seen this behavior before, of the bottom of the image perfectly aligned with the other characters in that line? Now, there is a way in word processing software. There's this little icon you can click, and now it does sort of do what you would hope it would do. This is known as floating, which also exists on the web as a different layout mode. But this sort of like, you know, you see that and you think, ah, so this is why everything on the web works the way that it does. Because, you know, when CSS first came onto the scene, it wasn't really meant to be used for layouts, but the layout system at the time, like the World Wide Web, was really just like a giant collection of hyperlinked documents. So this was the problem it was introduced to help solve. All right. So I was initially going to sort of go through a couple of these like examples in more depth. I trust that we all sort of understand what's going on with this basic HTML, but I do want to dig into this strong element. So I have this bold text over here. Let me select it, and let me set height 100 pixels. And it doesn't really seem to do anything, right? I'll give it an outline so we can see exactly what's going on. And like, it's curious, no matter how big or how small my height is, it doesn't seem to have any effect. The way that I explain this is that inline elements are pacifist. They are non-confrontational. They don't want to make a fuss, right? They just want to sort of sit in their little designated spot and go with the flow and not cause any problems. And this means that certain CSS just doesn't work, like also padding. Padding, 32 pixels. Well, this one does kind of work, but it's interesting, right? The box gets bigger, so I'll change this so we can see how it looks at different values. The box gets bigger, but notice that like the other paragraph doesn't move down to accommodate it. The heading, like the paragraph itself, doesn't shift around. So inline elements really don't want to like mess with the block direction layout. But what about inline block? Like this was one of those things, no matter how many times I would learn how it did, like you'd read these definitions that I'm not going to read here, but they would just like wash over you. And it refused to stick in my brain as to what was actually going on here. Here's the thing that finally made it click for me. An inline block element sits on the page as though it was an inline element, but it has a vote when it comes to layout. So we actually can use the full set of CSS properties, or at least the set that is available to block elements. So similar setup. I have a span that wraps around a couple of words. I've given it a red outline so we can see it. And now, if I give it height, let's say 100 pixels, check it out. We actually see that it grows. And not only that, it pushes the second paragraph down. So similarly, if I give it some padding, we see that the box gets bigger, but it also sort of pushes, and I should make this a little bit bigger. Hopefully that helps. It does sort of have this effect on the block layout. This does raise the question, though, like, given that inline block seems to be like an inline element, but without the restrictions, why isn't that the default behavior? Like, why do we even have inline? Why isn't inline block the way it works? Well, inline elements have a bit of a superpower. They have something they can do that, as far as I can tell, is unique across the entire CSS language. It's not something you can do in Flexbox or Grid. And not only is it a unique superpower, it's something you have absolutely used that every website, if it has text on it, uses this feature. It's not some like niche thing that doesn't come up. Anyone know what I'm talking about? No, cool. That superpower, and I realize it may be a little bit anticlimactic, is the ability to line wrap. So if we have a bunch of stuff inside that inline block element, we notice that we get like a bunch of space over here and a bunch of other space over here. The trade-off is that inline block elements will always form a rectangle in the same way that block elements, like if I change this to display block, it looks exactly the same. Inline block elements, like block elements, are always rectangular. But if I comment this out, we see that our inline element neatly it splits into two rectangles. The way that I describe this is like, it's almost like, I don't know if you've seen those sushi chefs where they have their nice bamboo mat and they put the seaweed and the rice and they roll it up like a big burrito and then they chop it into little circles and arrange them aesthetically. We have this big long rectangle that we're then sort of subsetting and creating these nice little sub-selections that wrap neatly around each line. Brad Frost yesterday said that we are more than rectangle creators, and that's true. Sometimes we are compound rectangle creators. So let's talk about Flexbox. Flexbox is interesting. It's another layout mode. So in our constellation of CSS, it is a separate little world, a separate star. And like each of these layout modes has a problem it wants to solve, like an area of expertise. Flexbox is all about, you have a group of stuff, one or more items, and you will want to arrange them along a primary axis. So I have this little demo. The interesting thing to me about Flexbox is that everything is pegged, or almost everything is pegged, not to like horizontal or vertical, but to this idea of the primary axis and the cross axis. So by default, the elements will stack sort of from start to end in a row. In English and other left to right languages, the start is at the left and the end is at the right, but that can be flipped. And we notice that so they're stacking from start to end, and we also have this cross axis, which runs perpendicularly. And in the cross axis, they're stretched, right? They're filling the available space. If I flip flex direction from row to column, it's like all of the same rules are being applied, but now they're stuck to the primary axis, and that axis has rotated. So now they're stacking from start to end. Start is at the top, end is at the bottom, and they're stretching across the cross axis. So everything, like The cool thing about Flexbox is when you get comfortable with it, all of a sudden you have it's like learning 2 for the price of 1. Like you can apply all the same rules to this other direction, and it all sort of works the same way. There is, for alignment, we have justify content and align items. And for longer than I care to admit, my attitude for this was that I want to align something, so I'd try one, and if it doesn't work, I try the other. And I heard someone say that sounds familiar. Yeah, that's the way we do it, right? And in fairness, both of these names are a little bit strange. Like, why is it justify content and align items? Let's break this up. Let's talk about first the prefixes, so justify and align. And justify refers to the primary axis. So, and that's like the one part you kind of have to memorize. I don't have like a neat trick for how to remember that. But yeah, so justify content is always about how we control their position in the primary axis, so I can put them at the start, or the end, or the center. Align items is the opposite, so it's how I align things in the cross axis. And I'll do this with a row, because rows are really more common. So we see that this is a way to move something either up, down, or I can stretch them across. Now let's talk about the second part, which is content versus items. Why is it content? Why is it items? Well, here's the interesting thing. The primary axis, and we see it here, it like skewers each of our items like vegetables on a kebab. That's not true for the cross-axis. Like, I can't draw a vertical line that intersects more than one of these children. That stops being true with FlexWrap, but we're going to set that aside and just talk about like the core Flexbox algorithm. This has an interesting implication because, like, let's say I have this second child, right? This item over here. Oh, took a screenshot. If I want that child to move to the start, no, that's not the right element. Yeah, ideally I would have like an actual nice control for this, but I'm going to do it in the dev tools. We have this align self property, and I'll set that to start. And we see now that the second child moves up. The second child has like its own column, right? Like, I can do whatever I want in this space without disrupting either of its neighbors. I can't do that in the primary axis. Like, I can't say I want this second child to move to the start because there's another child there, right? It doesn't have its own unique lane that it can move wherever it wants. And that's why it's called justify content. It's a little bit like, going back to our word processing, you know, we have this ability to align text. I can make it center aligned. I'm not thinking about like, okay, this word should move 10 pixels to the right, this word should move 9 pixels right. I'm not thinking about the individual position of each word, or worse yet, each letter. I'm thinking of this as a cohesive chunk of content that I want to align. And that's why like we have these kind of funky options like space between and space evenly. I'm not thinking about individual items, I'm thinking about a chunk of content. And that's why we talk about justifying the content. Whereas align items, it really is a bunch of individual items and they can each do whatever they want, right? In fact, I don't know that this is true, but I like to imagine it is. The CSS working group people that invented the language or work on the language, I like to think that align self is actually the main way this happens. Like, each child has this ability to position itself. And then they realize, like, well, wait a minute, it's going to be kind of annoying if we have to individually align each child. Let's add an align items like shorthand on the parent that sets the default value for each child. So like, this is really kind of syntactic sugar over what's really happening, which is each child controlling its own alignment. This is a fun example. So I have a form that has a label and an input. I've given the input flex1, which means that I want it to like grow and shrink to take up as much space as is available. But we notice something a little bit interesting. When I get below a certain size, it stops shrinking. And like the first sign of that is our label splits onto 2 lines. If I keep, and actually let me do this. I want to get rid of all the extra space because while it looks prettier, it gets a little bit in the way of us understanding. So I have like the input is growing and shrinking to fill the available space. Then it stops. Then it refuses to shrink anymore. The label starts shrinking, which causes it to line wrap. And if I keep going, eventually the label overflows, and we no longer have enough space for both of them. There's two like numbers that are important with Flexbox. The first is the hypothetical size, and this is actually what it's called, which I think is so whimsical. Hypothetical size. I like to think of it as like the aspirational size. It's the size it would like to be. So we saw this a little bit earlier. If I set width 2,000 pixels, In a flexbox context, well, we don't get 2,000 pixels, right? That is an unrealistic goal. So like, it winds up being as big as it can be without causing any problems. That's the hypothetical size. The other size that matters is the minimum content size. And I sort of forgot, like this actually I learned somewhat recently. Inputs have a size property. So if I set that size to 1, check this out, all of a sudden it can shrink as much as I need. If I set that size to like 50, well then it doesn't, and it overflows at a much earlier point, where now I have a much more significant problem. The size property is not measured in pixels, it's measured in characters. So this is the number of characters that are supposed to fit comfortably in an input, and that's the value that Flexbox uses as the minimum content size. That's the size below which it doesn't want to allow it to shrink, because that's how much space is needed for the content. We see an example of that. Let me get rid of this because it's too big. We see an example of this with the label, where like once the input can't shrink anymore, the label starts to shrink, and that immediately causes it to line wrap. If I keep shrinking, though, like I reach this point, and now there really isn't any more space for it to shrink, right? If it was to shrink anymore, it would wind up overflowing and covering the input. So for the label, the minimum content size is the length of the longest word. And that's why we wind up with the situation where both of the children are at their minimum content size, and there still isn't enough space, so it overflows. But we can overrule this. We can specify our own minimum content size, and we do that by setting min width to 0. And this is another, like, I feel like we memorize min width 0 as the magical incantation that solves our problem, but this is what's happening, right? We're redefining what the minimum amount of space for this element is, and now I can shrink as much as I want, which admittedly probably isn't what I want. Like, this doesn't seem like a great user experience. I think what I would actually do is set it to something reasonable, like maybe 6 rem, something like that. And then I would also use flex wrap so that below the certain point, they split onto its own line. I think this is probably what we want to do, but this is beyond the scope of what we're talking about today. Let's move on. Let's talk about positioned layout. And this one's like a little bit trickier. With flow layout, I have a nice definition, which is the Microsoft Word algorithm on the web. With Flexbox, the goal is to distribute a group of items along a primary axis. What about positioned layout, though? Well, it's sort of like a bunch of sub-layout modes. Like absolute positioning works very different from sticky positioning. So it's like further branching into different different stars in our constellation. But they do have something in common, which is that in positioned layout, we're disconnecting the element from its calculated layout, right, from where it would otherwise be, and we're anchoring it to something else. And the value of this something else depends on whether we're talking about absolute, fixed, sticky, or relative. So again, looking at the same example as before, I'm going to slap a position relative on the input, and nothing changes. Relative positioning is like the lightest touch. And the relative that it's talking about is that it's relative to its calculated position. So in this case, this input, it exists within a flex formatting context because the parent sets display flex, which means this input is calculated using Flexbox. It uses a Flexbox property, and after all that work is done, then it gets promoted to use positioned layout thanks to this position relative. And because we're using relative, it's relative to that default position. It's anchored to that default position, so it doesn't change on its own. But it does give me access to some additional CSS properties. Like I can use top 32, which shifts the element down by 32 pixels. And I need the position relative for this because the top property is not implemented inside Flexbox or inside all the other layout modes, right? It's exclusive to positioned layout. But really, positioned elements are most useful, or relative elements are most useful in tandem with other positioned elements. So let's move on. Absolute positioning I like to think of as like the magazine layout, like the collage sort of style where you want elements to be stuck in very specific places. Overlapping elements is very much the realm of absolute positioning. And the cute example I have for this is imagine we have an unruly teenager. That's, they've been acting up, so we've told them to go to their room. That room is defined here as a black box, right? 200 by 150, and the teenager is this pink circle. Now, the teenager is crafty. The teenager knows that if they use absolute positioning, they will no longer be constrained by this parent, And now they're going to be anchored to something else. So if I set top 0, left 0, check it out. They break free of their room, and they go hang out at the address bar. It's a little underage drinking joke for you. So yeah, what's interesting about this is that it is not always the case that an absolute child will be anchored to what appears to be the viewport, right? I should also specify that this sort of white box over here is an iframe. So like, in the context of the CSS that we're writing, the document, like the entire viewport is this white box. It's not using the whole window. But that's not always the way that it works. And the way that it works is a little bit complicated. Essentially, and I'm sure this isn't unfamiliar for many of us, but I'll explain it so that you have this as an explanation. The element will or the DOM will trace upwards looking for the nearest positioned ancestor. So it starts by looking at its direct parent. And it says, like, are you going to be the element that constrains this absolutely positioned child? If it uses the position property, so if I set position relative, then it becomes yes, right? That element does constrain the child. And so now, as that teenager's legal guardian, we have figured out how to recapture it. Like a Pokemon, it sounds like. But it's not always, this is what makes it confusing, is that it's not always any specific element. And this is sort of a silly example, but in a real example, it might be like 10 levels up, right? Because if it looks at the parent and that parent doesn't use the position property, then it looks at its grandparent and its great-grandparent, right? So it's going to go from this div class room to the body tag is probably its parent, then to the HTML tag above that. And if it makes it all the way to the top of the DOM without finding a suitable container, then it uses the initial containing block, which is a rectangle, the same size and shape as the viewport. But that's the way that it works, right? Absolute elements are anchored to the nearest positioned ancestor. And if there isn't one, then it uses the viewport. Fixed positioning is interesting. And yes, my image does load. The way that I like to explain fixed positioning is imagine you're on a train and you're watching this beautiful landscape sort of roll by outside your window. Then imagine a fly comes and lands on that window. And I've spared us all the unpleasantness of looking at a fly, so I've replaced it with a black circle. But if you're on the train and the landscape is sort of scrolling by, the fly isn't attached to that anymore. Like the fly has now stopped being part of the landscape and is now sort of part of your train. Like it's stuck to the glass of the train. And this is how I think we should think of a viewport, where you have a web page that is scrolling by, and you have a pane of glass that changes what part of that landscape you're looking at. Fixed position elements disconnect from their calculated layout and instead become anchored to the glass of our viewport. And that's why they don't move when you scroll. It's not because they're disabling scrolling. It's because they're anchoring to the viewport. Z-index. Who loves? Show of hands. Who's a fan of Z-index? Wow, okay, I wasn't expecting any hands there. Awesome. I can tell that I am with my people here. So this is the standard gotcha with positioned elements, right? I have this text, I have an image, the text is given z-index 10, the image is given z-index 1. Bigger numbers are supposed to show up in front of smaller numbers, but it doesn't, right? The image remains in front. Now, for a long time, I would have explained this using a not wrong, but incomplete explanation. And that incomplete explanation from 2012 or whatever, maybe a little bit later than that, 2017, let's say, would have gone something like this, and I have to get into character here. The z-index property has a dependency on the position property. So in order to use this property, I also need to add position relative. And when you add these two properties together, that fulfills the condition, and now the text is aligned. So that's my 2017 explanation. Not wrong, but incomplete. Again, that's sort of thinking of CSS as a collection of properties rather than a constellation of layout modes. The way that I would explain this now would go something like this. Z-index is a property that is implemented in some, but not all, of the layout modes. If I want to use the property, I need to pair it with one of those layout modes, and one of them is relative positioning. Interestingly, in this example, I don't actually need the z-index. If I get rid of this, it still works. And the reason for that is that positioned elements will automatically be promoted to sit in front of non-positioned elements. So this property alone is enough, and I don't need this either. Positioned elements will naturally sit in front. But there's something even more interesting here. let me get rid of all of this. In fact, let's just reset it. I'm going to select the parent element, the main container, and I'm going to set display flex and flex direction to column. So there's no position anywhere. There's no position relative, position absolute, but the text is in front. If I make the z-index of the image a bigger number, then it works, right? So it's not like some trick. Z-index is working the way that it works, and the reason for that is that the flexbox layout algorithm also implements the z-index property. So does grid. So it's not actually like a positioned layout exclusive. It's just like it's newer than flow layout is, so it wasn't implemented in flow layout. Let's talk about this example. And actually, Kevin Powell yesterday sort of previewed that I would talk about stacking context, and indeed I will. The setup here is that I have this header, and the header is given position relative, z-index 2. Then I have this tooltip, and the tooltip down here is given position absolute, z-index 999. So both of these elements are using the appropriate layout mode. They're using a layout mode that supports the z-index property. This is obviously a bigger number. 999 is bigger than 2. But our tooltip is sitting behind the header. So how can this be? Well, z-index values are not global. Like, it's not going to compare any two numbers anywhere in the DOM. Instead, it compares elements within the same stacking context. There's a number of ways to create stacking context, but the most common is by combining position relative with z-index. And so this header becomes a stacking context. And the effect of that is that it sort of flattens everything inside, which means that when I create a stacking context on the main element, so this main tag over here, realize it's kind of close to the bottom, this whole thing becomes flattened as a group. And as a group, the main tag is going to sit either above or below the header. And since 2 is a bigger number than 1, the main element wins. It's the way that I explain this for JavaScript developers is that it's like semantic versioning. So like if we're going through these elements one by one and figuring out what their version should be, header has a z-index of 2, so we'll say that's version 2.0. The main element has a z-index of 1, so I'll make that 1.0, or really just 1. I don't need the 0.0. That just makes it sound more version-y. This divs class tooltip sets z-index to be 999, but it doesn't make the version 999 because it's within this other element, so it's 1.999. And so like no matter how big I make this number, like we know from semantic versioning, 1 point anything is always going to be less than 2. Or where did my 2 go? So that's what's going on here, right? Stacking contexts wrap around all of their children, flattening them, and so that whole group will either move above or below something else. I could keep going. There's a lot that I could talk about, but we have a limited amount of time together today. But I do want to talk about something else. I want to sort of pivot a little bit at the end. I mentioned earlier that in 2020, I had left my job to focus on teaching, and I created my CSS course. But there was another thing that sort of prompted this. I injured myself. I got a nerve injury in my left arm that meant that when I would type, for more than a couple of minutes, I would get a burning in my elbow. And that spread weirdly from one arm to the other. It reflected across to my other side. And as a result, for about 6 months, this was what my desk looked like. Come on, image. There we are. I had no keyboard, no mouse. My input method was a microphone for dictation. And it's a little bit hard to see. I have an eye tracker that I stacked to the front of my iMac that acted as a mouse replacement. So where I would look is where my cursor would go. And this was really interesting, right? It gives you a new perspective when you have to try to work without your standard tools. After a couple of months of practice, I got to the point where I could like code at maybe half of my typical velocity. But half is not good. Like it was workable, but it wasn't great. And it sort of gave me this new impression that I imagined all of us have a number floating above our heads. And every time you press a key on your keyboard, that number decrements by 1, right? You have a limited number of these keystrokes in your future. And so this self-reflection, it made me realize that I should be treating this resource as like a scarce commodity, and I should really try to like put that resource towards things that are meaningful to me. In my case, that was teaching, because I had been teaching at a boot camp and thought it was really fun and meaningful, because you can watch people grow, and it's a wonderful feeling. So I would just encourage you to pursue things that are meaningful to you, whatever that happens to be. And I realize I have a screenshot hiding in the corner. If there's a project you want to start, if there's a new direction you want to go in, I used to think of myself as having like an infinite runway ahead of me. But that's not true, right? All of us have a limited amount of typing ability and just like output more broadly. So please do consider pursuing things that are meaningful to you. I have some slides, or not some slides, but some resources that include blog posts to things at joshwcomo.com/smashing. And that's my talk. Thanks so much. I finished 40 seconds early. I'm happy about that.
Well, Josh, look at us. I had to be in a phone call. This is so funny. Could you join me for the conversation? I really was. So we have I think the microphone is still on as well. So hello, everyone. Okay, all right. Jumping out in here for a moment. Well, I missed your talk entirely. Can you summarize it for me? No. But seriously, when I think like one of the things that I always struggle a little, like, and this is a conversation that we often have as well, is, well, CSS has become quite complicated.
Yeah.
I mean, we even have mathematical functions in CSS and
trigonometry.
Yeah. And sometimes people would say, well, it's like, why is it so complicated? Do we need to do it this way? Like, why is CSS becoming such almost like a beast? Almost like, in the past we were having conversations, well, CSS is not a programming language, but now it surely is.
Yeah.
Right?
It's definitely gotten to that point, yeah.
Yeah, and so what do you think? Again, you spending so much time under the hood and above the hood, I guess, right? Kind of looking into all of that. Do you think that this complexity helps people to get somewhere faster, especially if they're just getting started with CSS, or is it actually still confusing and we need maybe a different level of abstraction there?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, part of why I wanted to give this talk was that I knew so many, and why I focused on a course, is I knew so many JavaScript developers who were really comfortable with JavaScript, understood HTML pretty well, but had like a CSS-sized hole in their skill set. And the trouble, like especially with how much CSS is changing, it felt a little bit to me like developers kept stacking new Jenga bricks of CSS knowledge on like a really shaky tower. So like a lot of what I talk about here is stuff that hasn't changed in 20 years or 15 years. But they're still as relevant. And it's true, CSS has they keep adding new stuff, right? This is sort of the challenge of the web, is backwards compatibility. Maybe we wouldn't need so many different layout modes if we were designing it from scratch today, but we can't because websites were built in 2001 that expect things to work a certain way. But I think overall the changes are good. Like, container queries, the has selector, view transitions. There's so many things that were created because the alternative way of doing them was more complicated. And so it's about bringing a simpler way to do it. The challenge, of course, like with everything in CSS, is that the short nature of writing little key value pairs belies how complicated it all is. Container queries sound great when you see the syntax, but then you realize there's that whole with a media query, the media doesn't change. Like, there's no CSS you can write that changes the size of your viewport. Whereas with container queries, you can get into that ridiculously complicated situation where the CSS within the container query causes that condition to no longer be met, which is complicated, but it's less complicated than trying to do it all in JavaScript and have it be, because the reason media queries and now container queries are so useful is that they fire before JavaScript is loaded. Very long-winded way of saying that, yes, it is complicated.
Yes, that's okay, that's okay. I almost expected it to come, and it came really quickly. Josh.
Yes.
Tailwind. Do you believe, William is wondering, do you believe that CSS frameworks like Tailwind limit a developer's ability to discover a lot of the value and features you highlighted in vanilla CSS? As a student, I often find it easier to use a framework, but I feel like I miss totally on a lot of incredible CSS capabilities.
So, here's the thing. I want to be careful not to criticize something that I'm not an expert in, right? Because I've only used CSS for a few weeks. I did a test project in it, and I didn't love it. I found that it was forcing me to use an abstraction that didn't feel like it was bringing value, because I knew I could just as easily write the CSS myself. I didn't have to memorize a bunch of acronyms. So because of that, because I don't really feel like I know enough about, I used to have a criticism of Tailwind, that it didn't have a way to apply contextual style. So only apply this background color if there's a parent that has a certain selector. But apparently there is, I forget what it's called, groups or something. There is some way to do it in Tailwind that I didn't know of. So any criticism I would have is very possibly invalid because there is a way to do it. With that enormous caveat in mind, the way that I write CSS is often using a bunch of custom properties to like overrule stuff and to have, like, I don't know how you could use Tailwind to create like an eased gradient that has 15 steps. It seems like a lot of stuff to throw in the middle of your HTML. But I think that, like, as much as I am not a Tailwind fan myself, it's not my cup of tea, I'm excited that there is a tool that is getting developers excited about CSS. And I think that, like, objectively, it solves the most important set of problems, which is like scoping, right? The ability, I don't like with naming methodologies like BEM, you have to make sure that every selector has a globally unique name because there wasn't a way to scope it. Tailwind solves that because there is no class names. Everything is just utility functions. So I think that it's, like, objectively it solves the problems that are important. And I'm really trying to not be the cantankerous, shaking my fist at the clouds, telling all the new people that they don't know what they're doing. They do know what they're doing. And I think that it does solve a lot of problems that people have. So as much as it pains me to admit it, I'm becoming a pro-Tailwind person.
Yeah. Says one person in the room who is also biased. Just saying. Okay, Josh. It's like really loaded questions coming in.
Yeah, of course.
Backend developers.
Right? They exist.
Yes.
Can confirm.
Yes, so Elian is saying, how would you recommend to communicate with developers that are terrified to attempt front-end? Maybe they're very, very back-end driven, even though their title says full-stack engineer. Upside smiley face. Right? How could I get your energy to peer review the problem and break down to solving the itty-bitty CSS? And what would be your recommending steps to approach how to break down the problem and get backend developers excited about CSS?
That's a great question. I feel like that could be a whole conference talk.
I mean, we have 4 minutes.
It is like, this is, I have, my partner's father does a thing where he teaches high school students or various ages, like at a summer camp kind of thing, how to code. And they do like robotics, they do a bunch of stuff. And, it occurred to me that the tools that I use in my daily life are wildly unsuitable for those types of situations. In the same way that, like, all of the modern stacks that we have and all the tools that we use are beneficial and make sense for professional developers, but they do add so much friction, not friction, but like stuff that people have to learn in order to become productive, that it strikes me as a problem when, you have like the back-end developer that wants to contribute and you have to go through like, so there's so much like, stuff in the way of helping them contribute that I feel sort of it's a double-edged sword where all of the tools that make it more productive for us come at this huge cost. In terms of like how to facilitate that, I think that like, and it's tricky because like I legitimately really enjoy like spending 15 minutes with somebody and helping fill in some of those gaps. So like I think I don't really see the problem. Like just like do what I did sort of in this talk and work through as they have problems, help fill in that context. But there isn't a shortcut for it. Like it does take a whole bunch of time, and it is just like I wish I had like a zippier answer, but it's one of those things that is tricky.
I think it was so funny because a couple of months ago, for the very first time in my life, I met a person who didn't know what Internet Explorer is.
Wow.
And oh, okay. That my jokes don't work, but this works. They're incredible. Like, I don't know what to say, but I mean, it was quite impressive for me because I mean. At this point, I think it's still in 2024 very difficult to get a project where you will not have a conversation about Internet Explorer. And I mean, it's just incredible how far we've come, right? But I'm wondering at this point, when you think about, in general, like backwards compatibility, so when you see new features coming in, and we have the baseline, right, which basically covers, like, the feature is out in all modern browsers, do we need to think about legacy browser support? Like, I mean, one of them that's coming up all the time, Opera Mini. Right, Opera Mini Opera Mini. This is a special Opera Mini, but it's important, right? But it always gets read, and can I use that command?
Or I forget what CS browser, UC browser.
Yeah.
That's another one.
Yeah. So how do we then approach? Like, what is the modern way of approaching this today? So when you want to write all the cool, shiny new stuff in CSS, do we then rewrite it in float left and float right?
I have so many things to say. The first thing I think we have... All right, I'm going to have to talk very quickly. The first thing is that you have to figure out who your users are, right? So like I have a blog. That blog doesn't have many people that use Internet Explorer because it's for developers, and most of us don't use those tools. So it depends who your users are. It also depends what you're building. Like I would have a much higher standard for like, you know, healthcare products or like access to local food banks, right? Things that like are legitimately required for people to live their life. I feel like that has a higher standard of browser support than like if you're building luxury yacht rental. Like that you can go ahead and ignore whatever browsers you want because nobody's life is made worse by that, or at least not in an irreconcilable way. So those are the two things that I would focus on, like who are our users and what is our standard. Then it's about figuring out, okay, like what percentage is our threshold. When I worked at Khan Academy, we had like, I think it was 1%. And Internet Explorer was annoyingly persistently above that because there would be like computer labs that the admin quit 7 years ago. And there's a bunch of like high schools that just have computers and no one's going to update, you know, there's nobody there that can update them. And we wanted to work in the school lab, so we had to support it. So it's really just about doing the math of figuring out what do you need in every individual circumstance.
Mm. And maybe the final question, do you have a CSS feature very high on your wish list?
I was just thinking about this today. Maybe this is a proposal. I haven't seen it. I want a way to have a pseudo class for things like whether a sticky element is stuck or not. Wouldn't it be nice to say like ampersand stuck equals true and then apply a different background color if a sticky element has reached? Or like if an overflowed, something with overflow auto, if there is an overflowing child or not. Like having ways to style based on a bunch of those intrinsic states. It probably exists in a proposal somewhere. And this is my call to anyone that knows to go add some +1s to that proposal.
Well, if that call doesn't bring us to a wonderful lunch break, not lunch break, break, I don't know what will. Well, so thank you so much for being with us, Josh.
Thank you.
Thank you.